Well, guys, we did it. We finally hit those 50K subscribers, and honestly, we can't thank you enough. And I figured we had to do something fun to celebrate, and of course, with the Halloween season upon us, that Chucky-themed Fanta is hitting the store. So I figured, let's chug this thing in honor of that 50K. Now, normally, I would do something a little more manly, like a Zima, but I am fresh out. And then, fun fact, I do absolutely hate fruit punch. So, let's see how this goes. Top was a little risky. Please don't unsubscribe. Welcome back to the channel, ladies and gents, and boy, oh boy, do we have quite the doozy of a list today. It's getting chillier here in Northeast Ohio, so we all know that seasonal depression is on the horizon, and with self-loathing being the rage here on Splattercast, I figured let's jumpstart this bitch and start feeling bad about ourselves. So I've compiled 5 films that broke me. Yes, they put my emotions over their knee and spanked them like I was on the naughty list. I'm a broken man. Making us cry in the number 5 spot, me and Earl and the Dying Girl. High schooler Greg, who spends most of his time making parodies of classic movies with his coworker Earl, finds his outlook forever altered after befriending a classmate who has just been diagnosed with cancer. I picked this one up on Blu-ray after hearing some buzz about it upon its release, and this film has grown to become more and more personal to me over the couple past years. The film starts off with some really great comedy and has such an awkward tone that makes for some really great laughs.
Pomona, Princeton?
I'm not getting into Princeton.
He's not getting into Princeton.
So when we get into more of those serious issues of the film, it makes it that much more dark. Greg is this unique character that explains how he's become acquaintances with every different clique in the school without really developing any sort of deep-rooted friendships other than Earl, who even there, he calls his coworker rather than his friend. Then we see Earl even explain this a little bit later in the film, that it's due to Greg's own insecurities and fear that people may actually not want to be his friend.
Bottom line, dude's terrified of calling somebody his friend, and they saying, hey bro, I'm not your friend.
So as we see this friendship form between Greg and Rachel, who is referenced as the Dying Girl, and we see this grim outcome, it becomes that much more heartbreaking in the end. Death is a part of life that we can never really prepare for, but as we get older, it kind of becomes this impending storm, so we try to mentally equip ourselves the best we can. One of the aspects of this film is that we're dealing with these issues at a high school age, and it really breaks your brain because of the mindset death doesn't really come typically at the stage of this life. In high school, I had a friend pass away over a freak accident over the summer, so going back to school that senior year, it was such a weird feeling among everyone in the class. Whether you're really outgoing or not, the faces in school become so familiar that when one person tragically isn't there anymore, you feel this vacant spot for such a long time, and that realization sets in that just because you're young doesn't mean tomorrow is guaranteed. This film has this comedic tone that makes you forget of its grim story briefly at times, almost giving you this false sense of security, and even Greg does drop a line in the film reassuring the audience that Rachel doesn't die in the end. When Rachel finally succumbs to her cancer, Greg tells the audience that he knows he lied, but he really didn't think Rachel would die in the end. That line hits so much harder now because I can understand it way better than when I initially watched this film. My wife's grandfather had battled cancer and was in remission up until a couple years ago when the cancer had come back, and reflecting on that line from Greg, it is so relatable because at the start of these journeys, we always have that attitude of, hey, we'll get through this like we did last time. Unfortunately, her granddad did pass away in early June, and I was the one who answered that early morning call at 5 a.m. to get the news of his passing, and for some reason this film popped into my head as I sat on the hallway stairs preparing to tell my wife, because that line from Greg just became all too real that morning. When Rachel tells Greg she's going to quit doing chemo treatments, we see that strong emotion from him because he knows what that means and that little bit of hope that he was hanging on to is going to be completely extinguished. I mentioned this film has so many great elements of comedy that make you forget of the melancholy story, but after that 60-minute mark, there are so many dark emotional shifts, you are really terrified to see the outcome of the film. Oddly enough, my brother was diagnosed with cancer in June as well, so I've been taking him to chemo treatments, and I see firsthand of how much that does take out of a person. So that thought of someone not wanting to continue gets so scary. At times like those, sometimes hope is the only thing you can hang on to. After Rachel's passing, we see Greg in her room reading a letter that Rachel had left for him, and reflects on her funeral where he heard a story about Rachel wanting to become a squirrel. A story he had never heard of before, and says maybe that's what his teacher meant by someone's life continues to unfold. After being through so many different events over the past couple months and then rewatching this, I'm really able to apply that line a lot better than I ever have been. It really resonates and becomes so meaningful because after someone's passing, you share so many stories and learn so many things about a person that you never thought to ask when they were here. This film becomes more and more important as we make our way through life, and as I understand this film better, along with that comes a lot more heartbreak. But this is such a phenomenal watch. Coming in the number 4 spot, Mask. A teenager with a massive facial skull deformity and a biker gang mother attempt to live as normal a life as possible under the circumstances. Mask is a film that was so ingrained into my childhood. It was one of those movies you would always find when you were just flipping through channels. Being one of my mother's favorite films, I watched this countless times, and I think growing up, we all have that one film that kind of makes us a little bit more emotionally aware in a sense, and Mask was that film for me. I loved action and horror films growing up, so those were the types of films that would always keep my attention as a little kid. So when a drama was on TV, I would watch parts of the film, but rarely ever sat down to watch it from beginning to end. But Mask was that exception to the rule. Even as a 7-year-old, I knew this film had quite the emotional weight, and I felt bad for Rocky Dennis. And even though I was a little kid at the time, so I didn't fully grasp his struggle, it really did give me a sense of empathy that I don't remember getting from other films being that young. I knew this one was going to be on the list, so rewatching it and not having seen it for probably over 2 decades, I'll be honest with you, this one got a few tears from me because I was able to put a completely different perspective on this viewing because now I'm a parent. When we first see Rocky, he's in this hospital setting, he's getting his jaw and head measured, and the first thing we notice is how easygoing he is and familiar with the process. It adds this slight moment of comedy and also this likability to Rocky, but reflecting on how familiar he is with everything makes you really realize how much of a big portion of his life the hospital setting is. As a kid watching this movie, I never really appreciated the parent-child relationship, but rewatching this through the lens as a parent, it really hits at a completely different emotional level. You always have that protectiveness as a parent and any outside threat you're going to be on guard for, but fighting a disease that will eventually take the life of your child and knowing Cher must come to terms with that just slowly ripped my heart out for 2 hours straight. Watching Cher play this mom who is also struggling with substance issues that forces Rocky at times to become the parent and take care of things adds this extra layer that makes you root for Rocky even harder. When Rocky confronts his mother about her substance issues, they have this huge blow up, but when Rocky has this massive headache at night, we see that mother-son relationship of her coming to his aid, and it really has this heartwarming dynamic. This film really does have a sentimental quality to it. Throughout the film, Rocky has this positive disposition, even though he deals with so many different issues, but we start to see him crave that normalcy other kids have. Rocky sees himself in this funhouse mirror at one point that distorts him enough that he almost looks normal. As he stares at his reflection, he brings his mother over to see, and they're just both enamored at what could be. And this film has that mix of gloom but hopefulness that really takes you on a very long emotional journey. One of the most heartwarming moments in the film is when Rocky finds love and goes to visit Diana, who he hasn't had contact with since leaving the camp that he was a counselor at. Rocky's world is collapsing around him, but he finds out that Diana still loves him, and he says that everything is going to be okay.
That's what's kind of funny, it doesn't matter. It's okay now, because I know you still love me.
This film has a way of tugging at your heartstring and giving you a moment where you can let out this exhale of reassurance, only to give you the biggest gut punch of the film moments later. When Rocky passes away from his disease, it's just this entire sequence of pain. From the moment Rusty gets a call from the school that Rocky didn't show up, that look she gets when she gets off the phone, she already knows, and so do we, what the outcome is. I get tears from that phone call all the way up until when the credits roll. The poem that Rocky reads at the end of the film while we're at his grave is without a doubt one of the most beautiful scenes in cinema. On this rewatch and now being a father, this film emotionally just heightened to an even greater level. It hits on so many different levels of beauty and pain. Having a death grip on the number 3 spot, The Wrestler. A faded professional wrestler must retire, but finds his quest for a new life outside the ring a dispiriting struggle. I've been a huge fan of professional wrestling my entire life, and this one has to be one of my favorite watches, but at the same time is honestly one of the most depressing watches because of how good the film is at portraying this world. Growing up, I didn't really read comic books. I watched some of the films and cartoons when they were on television, but pro wrestlers like Macho Man Randy Savage and Roddy Piper were those larger-than-life superheroes. Keeping up with pro wrestling, I was able to see this weird life change for a lot of pro wrestlers, going from these larger-than-life characters to losing their physiques and struggling with addiction and honestly just becoming real people. That is what Darren Aronofsky does so well from the very start of this film. We see these magazines and 8x10s of Randy the Ram Robinson from the 80s. He really does look like a real-life superhero, and then moments later, reality puts us in a headlock. When we fast forward to current times, as Randy's in a grade school classroom after his match and gets an underwhelming payday because the crowd wasn't as big as the promoter had hoped. That harsh reality continues when Randy arrives home to his trailer but realizes he's been locked out because he hadn't paid his rent, so he has to sleep in his van and just has a dinner of pills and beer. The film has this level of somberness throughout as we see what Randy's life has become, and that is all too real when you look at a lot of pro wrestlers that have lived that fast life, not really worrying about their future until one day that glitz and glamour just all dries up. This film really acts as a pseudo-documentary that can be applied to so many pro wrestlers' lives, as there are so many examples of wrestlers who are just shells of their former selves, but continue to batter their bodies because it is really all that they know. After Randy suffers a heart attack and he gets the news that he's no longer able to step inside the ring after decades of beating up his body, there comes that realization of what is my life now that I don't have this one thing that has consumed and really strangled every relationship the Ram has had. There's a scene in here that is absolutely gutting as Randy goes to this fan fest where he's going to be signing autographs since he's had his heart attack and there's nothing else that he can do, and we get to see all these other former pro wrestlers who are also dealing with a lot of other health issues. The reason it is so scary is because it is so real. Going to a lot of smaller independent wrestling shows throughout my life, you see so many guys that are struggling to get by and they're unable to do the physical portion of the profession that they've dedicated their lives to, so they hope that they can sell enough of autographs or t-shirts just to get by on that past fame that they've had. When you get into the deeper personal layers of Randy's life, you get to watch him try to rekindle this relationship with his daughter, and it just becomes another moment of heartbreak during the film as we see this guy who's really just unable to get his shit together. We actually get this little glimmer of hope when Stephanie, his daughter, agrees to go out with him for the day, and by the end of it, she grabs his arm, and it makes us believe just for a moment that there can be some light at the end of this tunnel. But after a night of partying like a fireman and a little bit too much booger sugar, that relationship becomes completely severed when Randy oversleeps and he leaves Stephanie waiting for him at a restaurant. Coming to terms with having nothing else, Randy decides to step back into the ring one last time, even if that does mean death, which the ending is open to interpretation, but I've always felt like Randy meets his demise once the credits start to roll. Giving that speech where he says he burned the candle at both ends feels like such a farewell speech as he is getting prepared to die in the ring because that is really the only home that he has.
The only ones who are going to tell me when I'm through doing my thing is you people here.
Getting lost in this wacky world of professional wrestling makes this film so rewatchable, and even if you're not a big pro wrestling fan, I think you can be enamored with that storytelling and getting lost in that world because it is so foreign and sometimes unbelievable to what you would think is actually going on there. And honestly, for that human story, The Wrestler is so poetic as it is somber. Slipping our minds in the number 2 spot, The Father. A man refuses all assistance from his daughter as he ages. When he tries to understand what is happening around him, he begins to doubt his loved ones, his own mind, and even the fabric of his reality. This film still maintains being the most frustrating watch I've ever had, and I love this film, but I intentionally stay away from actually revisiting it. Actually, I've only seen it twice before, and now a third time to refresh for this list, and I gotta be honest, I remember why. This is the only film on the list that I actually had a bit of anxiety going in for a rewatch, just because you're left with this lingering feeling of melancholy for days after. And you know, being horror fans, I think a lot of us can relate to being more than a little desensitized to a lot of horror stories. But when it comes to these relatable stories of dementia or cancer, those are some of the most terrifying stories out there. Now, if you haven't seen it before, the narrative style is being told through the lens of Anthony, who is played by Anthony Hopkins, and it creates this disorienting feel because we're never really confident of what exactly is going on since he is dealing with some dementia. And very early on in the film, we see characters that start to change in appearance or repeat the same interaction with a completely different character, and establishing that Anthony is just so unreliable that evokes this frustration onto us, the audience, which puts us directly into his shoes. Looking at films like Pulp Fiction or Memento, where they're told in this unique way and they really want to give us this oh shit moment when we start really crafting that timeline and they give us all the information that we need. But with The Father, we really don't get that. You're always left second guessing yourself, and you don't really get that gratifying experience of putting that last piece of the puzzle in its place. It really just feels like you're leaving these puzzle pieces all scattered across the floor throughout the entire film. Seeing the way Anthony goes off on these tangents because he's lost in a completely different moment entirely gives you just this big gut punch, and it keeps happening one after another. And for me personally, I haven't had to deal with dementia in my immediate family, and it's always this looming cloud of anxiety. But as a kid, I did have an experience that has haunted me even growing up. My grandmother was at an assisted living home after a hospital stay, and I was like 6 or 7 at the time. While I was waiting in her room, this random woman appeared in the doorway, and I guess I must have reminded her of someone that she knew because she grabbed my arm and told me that we had to tunnel under the beds to escape. And for me, not understanding dementia until a few years later, that interaction freaked me out growing up, and I think it adds to some of the horror just dreading the psychological terror of dementia. To be honest, that story does still freak me out as an adult, so never leave your kid unattended at an assisted living facility. The range of emotions from Anthony in the story is another reason so many scenes become so tense. That portrayal of dementia is so authentic and heartbreaking, not just for Anthony, but for every other character around him. Watching Anthony be jovial when meeting Laura as he puts on this display of tap dancing and he's kind of just luring Laura in, and then he flips the switch and begins to berate her, it really just showcases that range of emotion this film covers.
I had you there, didn't I?
The erratic behavior, the ever-changing moods, and even bringing up Lucy, his daughter who has clearly passed away, shows that mental toll his disease takes on everyone around him. Seeing Anthony yelling at Anne to only moments later thank her for everything, long forgotten the argument previously, brings that emotional disorientation the father really excels at. And every time I watch this film, I'm hit with this odd level of guilt as we see Anne, who's trying to take care of her father, and I think that can hit people at a really raw level. Wanting to take care of the person who cared for you as a child, but then care for your own children as well, always having a certain level of inadequacies, like you aren't doing enough. It's even more amplified here with Anthony dealing with dementia and trying to live her own life. That last 10 minutes of the film is probably one of the most emotional scenes in recent memory. A film like this really just slices you open and rips out every kind of emotion you could possibly have, which is why this one is such a tough watch. Breaking our spirit in that number 1 spot, Chained. Held captive by a serial killer since the age of 8, a teen must choose between escape or following in his captor's bloody footprints. This film has some truly haunting scenes, and whenever we're dealing with a serial killer film, there is this different sense of terror because of that realism. The way Rabbit is put in some of these scenes, especially at the start of the film, can literally make you ill. When Rabbit and his mother are first attacked, Vincent D'Onofrio drives them back to his secluded home, dragging the mother out of the car, leaving Rabbit locked inside the back seat. And then Rabbit must listen to his mother being assaulted and eventually murdered as he sits there unable to do anything. Vincent D'Onofrio explains Rabbit's new world of serving him and cleaning his house as he explains one of Rabbit's new jobs is to cut out articles of missing people from his scrapbook, since I guess every good serial killer needs a few memories, right?
Look at this photograph. Every time I do, it makes me laugh.
As we cut to our killer reading the newspaper, he notifies Rabbit there is a great article about him and his mother being missing and for Rabbit to cut it out. How casual he is about making Rabbit cut out his own article after just violently assaulting and killing his mother really just made me cringe on a completely different level. Then we have Rabbit, who attempts to escape shortly after his capture, but as he kicks out this little window and climbs out onto the roof, Vincent D'Onofrio is already on the ground waiting for him. He eggs him on from the ground as he throws rocks at him, letting him know everything he does is because he lets him do. And it really is just this scene that evokes that helpless dynamic between captor and captive. Then we realize Rabbit is just an average Joe and he can't dodge a rock, so there's no way he's going to be able to dodge a wrench.
What?
It is scary what a human being can get used to when they've been exposed to a situation for so long. Seeing Rabbit go from this little boy hesitantly watching television, then to a teenager still chained up, but almost losing himself in a television show is another scary element that adds to the bleak tone of this film. Getting deeper into the story, there's such a warped and twisted spin on what we would normally see as a wholesome family dynamic. Vincent D'Onofrio wants to take this pseudo-father type role to Rabbit, wanting to impart knowledge onto who he sees as his own son. Having that grim aspect to each situation, he has Rabbit study body parts, even having organs from his victims sitting on the dinner table helping Rabbit study. The two even play this demented game of guess who with the driver's license of past victims as they each call out names while the other has to run down the address, weight, and how they even met their demise. I can't say for sure, but I assume this is what goes on in the types of people's houses that bring a veggie tray to game night. Now, what got me to turn on this film randomly one day was knowing that it starred Vincent D'Onofrio, and being a huge fan of Criminal Intent, I wanted to see how he would tackle this type of subgenre, and his portrayal of a serial killer is right up there with Matt Dillon and Dylan McDermott. Just like those two, he found this unnerving groove to really make this disturb you. He gives this character these little quirks that give you little hints into his psyche, but also presents this imposing force, constantly delivering these beatings to Rabbit. After forcing Rabbit to have his first kill, seeing Vincent D'Onofrio waking up from a nap in his chair, he sees Rabbit dragging this body out of the room, and then there's this slight smirk on Vincent D'Onofrio's face, almost like a proud father as he falls back asleep. Gives so much insight into how unhinged his character really is. Where we find ourselves in the third act and where the story finds itself takes the situation Rabbit is in and heightens it to an even more hopeless level, but in a way that I never expected. If you haven't seen this one, put it on your watch list, but beware, you won't want to use an Uber or taxi ever again. What a journey this was, and I thought this would be a great idea at the start, but I'm wrapping a bow on this bad boy, and I'm not eager to revisit this idea anytime soon. At least I need to get 5 therapy sessions under my belt before I even think about doing another 5 films that broke me. But hey, let me know down below what films broke you, and maybe if some of these did as well. But if you enjoyed the content, please like, share, and if you just peruse the channel and you're not subscribed, please think about considering sticking around and joining the Splatter fam. We'd love to have ya, but until next time, I'm Luke Janesco, and stay scared.
Do the hard shit, gonna do it live, cause Splattercast kick it every day they live. Splattercast, gonna smash your ass. 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 Splattercast, gonna smash your ass.